Hi everyone, welcome. Here are the big takeaways from this chapter 6 about survey research and questionnaire design. First, recall in the earlier chapter about measurement. Psychological science needs us to get specific and define our concepts very carefully. Remember also that there are 3 ways to measure any psychological variables. Number 1, behavioral observation. That's the frequency of some behavior that represents a mental state. Number 2, physiological measures like heart rate or blood pressure. And number 3, self-report measures like surveys, questionnaires with a numerical scale, again, believed to represent a mental state. That is our current topic today. So, first big takeaway from this chapter, let's start with surveys, also known as questionnaires. We'll use these 2 words interchangeably here, okay? Analytic surveys are the most common used in psychological science to demonstrate relationships between variables that interest us. Descriptive surveys only gather data to describe, like what percentage of the population has a certain characteristic. In this chapter, familiarize yourself with the most common formats for conducting surveys. Surveys as personal interviews were once very common to gather information on a one-on-one question and answer type of format. Mail-out questionnaires used to be very popular, like paper surveys mailed to your house. Note that these are both self-report instrument types that ask the participant to answer each question on their own. These formats have largely been replaced today by online questionnaires, online surveys, and you yourself may have been asked to participate in an online survey at some point. The great advantage of mail and online questionnaires was the ease of distribution and ease of collecting data, relatively low cost, especially the online version, and the relative anonymity that we can promise our participants. They fill it out by themselves, right? But here's a big takeaway. Notice that each type of survey used, we must question who in the sample might we be missing out on. That is, because of how a researcher has chosen to survey participants, they're always oversampling certain people based upon their characteristics and undersampling other people based upon their characteristics. We want to watch for this when thinking critically about published research using surveys. So, for example, when national voting polls that ask, who are you going to vote for, they make phone calls to households. Their goal is to get a national representative sample of eligible voters. But wait a minute, many people no longer even have a house phone, have a landline phone, right? They only use their cell phones, which is a mostly private phone number. National polling agencies like Roper and Gallup cannot access your cell phone number. So these voting polls, these national voting polls, calling houses tend to oversample people who still have house phones. And these people tend to be older in age. They tend to be homeowners, not renters. They tend to be people who answer the phone even when you don't know who is calling. Today with caller ID, many people do not always answer the phone, right? Among those who do always answer the phone, they tend to be older and accustomed to that traditional habit from years past before caller ID existed. So in a national voting poll, a national survey questionnaire of eligible voters, they may undersample young people, renters instead of homeowners, or people who just tend to not answer phone calls from strange people, from strange numbers. Watch for this when critically thinking about published research using surveys and questionnaires. If a research article says, San Antonians think a certain opinion, look carefully at how they gathered their survey data. If they stop people on the street to gather opinions, then they only talk to people walking on that street on that day. It is surely not a representative sample of San Antonians, right? Second big takeaway to watch for, remember that surveys and questionnaires are highly vulnerable to social desirability bias, especially when a researcher is asking sensitive questions about private or intimate topics. And remember this stuff is exactly what interests psychologists. Private thoughts, intense feelings, personal opinions. Psychology researchers must be especially careful to minimize social desirability bias, which again is the tendency for respondents or participants to distort answers, to change their answers in ways that may make them look better or will avoid making them look bad. This means study participants may not always be telling the truth in their responses. Now, truthfully, all psychological research is vulnerable to this, so please be sure to review from Chapter 4 on ethics We offer anonymity. We promise confidentiality. These are good ethical practices, but important here in this chapter because these are ways to make participants feel more comfortable about giving honest responses to our questions. And finally, in this chapter, takeaway number 3, be sure to also read in this chapter about some basic principles of questionnaire design and survey construction. Asking questions about subjective experiences, that's attitudes, opinions, feelings, tends to be more complicated than asking factual questions like your age. Be sure to read carefully the PDF file in this Blackboard folder called Survey Construction Pitfalls to Avoid for several examples of poorly designed survey questions. So in summary, guys, in the big takeaways from this chapter, chapter 6 about survey research and questionnaire design are these. Number 1, surveys and questionnaires are very common in psychological research, and as a healthy skeptic, you want to be watchful of how researchers have chosen their participants. We have to choose a small sample that we hope to make as representative as possible. Number 2, remember that surveys and questionnaires are highly vulnerable to social desirability bias, where the participant wants to look good or avoid looking bad. Offering anonymity, promising confidentiality, or how we minimize that. Number 3, of course, be sure to read about principles of good questionnaire design. Those are the big takeaways from this chapter 6 about survey research and questionnaire design. Thank you, everybody.